talk for a second I before I pass it over to Edgar. And I thought about asking Edgar to come to FotoFika a couple weeks ago when he posted on I think it was in the photography professor's Facebook page. I don't know, or maybe you just posted it on your own page, but about he was about to check out equipment to his students for the semester, and I thought it would be really interesting to start looking at all the different ways people are teaching. And then we had Marnie. So I've been excited to have Edgar come this week. But as we talked about that, the conversation turned into talking about a lot of other things. I first met him kind of briefly, actually, when he was getting his PhD at ASU in sustainability, and he was working with Mark Klett. And I think we went on a camping trip together or something like that. But actually, we've connected more recently when he's been at the University of Michigan and Michigan State, and I've visited my family and my daughter there. So, and we just have some really great, exciting, I think, conversations about photography, but about a lot of other things. So, I'm gonna pass it over to you, Edgar, to talk a little bit about your program, and then some of the other ideas that we talked about. So yeah, so without further ado, I hand it over to you.
Hello, everyone. So Betsy mentioned that I was doing my PhD at ASU, and so I was doing my PhD in sustainability. But when I started my PhD, my kind of primary focus was how do we intersect the arts with the sciences, and having art as a way of knowing. So I started working with Bill Jenkins first at ASU. My first semester, we put one foot over in the School of Art, and by the second semester, I was working regularly with Mark, and then he ended up being my co-chair. So my committee ended up being Mark, Ben Mentier, who is over in the life sciences, Ed Hackett, who was a sociologist, and Dan Childers, who was an ecologist. So I had a very eclectic group, and my job was to put a lot of this work together, both kind of in traditional ways of knowing, as you might consider in a PhD, but also art as a way of knowing, and how that kind of intersected with the work I was doing. A lot of the work that I've talked about has been on the fact that, with climate change, with COVID, we regularly talk about if we just knew the facts, but we've known the facts all along, and we continue to talk about the facts, and as if they change anybody's minds, right? And really, even now that we're more politicized, we understand how important values are and interrogating value structures, which is kind of bread and butter for the arts. And so it's become kind of critical for me to try to further intersect the arts with the sciences. I have a grant into the National Science Foundation. I'm working at long-term ecological research sites, artists and scientists working together and collaborating from the very beginning. And in doing all this, I also was trying to get my foot in the door over at the art school at MSU, trying to teach in terms of thinking about this conceptually as well. So I started teaching at a darkroom course. And so I'll discuss just a little bit technically what I'm doing there. Everybody started to check out equipment. I want everybody to still be able to do their a darkroom course at home. And so we started setting up kits, figuring out how they could do this. They checked out scanners, and then we started getting them equipment. And one of the big things, again, so there's two ways that I think about sustainability. One is kind of like to check the list to do things, right? Let's not put any contaminants into the environment. Two is how do we think about things conceptually in terms of how we relate our relationships to environment. So in the course, I've stuck to black and white, pretty benign chemistry, and then I'm working on cyanotypes. Again, just benign chemistry. So, and I've mentioned this to them as well, that there's certain cyanotype chemistries that use potassium dichromate as well. And I tell them that I've stayed away from that and why I've stayed away from it, and how, we're in Detroit, right? And East Lansing is there, and Flint is just 40 minutes from East Lansing to think about, how we think about water and things. But also I talk to them a lot about conceptually, how do we think about art as a way of knowing? So I've kind of done that, and in order to get them moving forward on kind of these concepts, I decided to do away with 35 millimeter and medium format in terms of teaching them, and went straight to 4x5. And we did a couple of things. One, check out the equipment. Two, now mine has blue so they could see, but we cut out pinhole kits for everybody. And then we got online. What I'm doing is the classes are 3 hours long, still on Zoom, and we use them as studio time. I say, all right, let's get our kits out, and we all build them together. We troubleshoot together. We look at them together. And I'll show you. Can I share my screen? Yep. All right. So this is a student recently who made some from her pinhole camera.
Huh.
Her first shots. And basically, I just help them kind of troubleshoot through the process. You know, I tell them exactly what a focal length should be approximately for this, the exposures. So they have like, they get the kit in a little bag. They get a full set of instructions for everything. They get told, you know, okay, your f-stop is going to be 250. I show them how to calculate that if you're using a light meter, right, from f22 to f64. How do your stops work? And that can get complicated for them. So then I show them as well, like, all right, how would you do this if you could find an iPhone app, right? And then how could you guesstimate it? If you say it's sunny out at f250, that's approximately 5 seconds, whatever it might be. And I let them choose. But the big thing about it is let them experiment. So they document everything. And then when we meet the next time in class, I'll ask them, okay, so you made a couple of shots. What do you think of them? You know, and they'll tell me, oh, I think it's underexposed. Oh, how did you shoot that? What are your numbers? You know, what were your, and so we troubleshoot together. And so granted, my class is small, right? Because it's kind of a darkroom class. We have 10 students, so it makes it a lot easier to do something like that. But we go through the full process. And then in terms of processing, this is what I use for them. So a daylight tank. And not only did we get them daylight tanks, I sent them home with a couple of negatives, like just use negatives, and tell them, you know, load your film holders, load your tanks over and over again, do it in the dark, figure it out. And then the guy who builds these from Stearman Press, I got in contact with him, and he came online actually Monday, and we developed together. So I was like, we're going to get straight from the person who developed it. We're going to talk to him about, you know, how he came up with the tank, because he's an engineer by training. And so I continuously try to get them back and forth, right, between thinking technically about how this is, the skills that you pick up on here will be used later on, but also show them conceptually how stuff works, right? Like your ideas have to matter. You can make technically boring and shitty pictures, right? And you can make pictures that technically aren't very good, but they're extremely compelling. And I'll show them photographers like Kudelka, who, you know, didn't use his own system, but how the images actually read differently, and you know, how that actually relates to visual literacy. But yeah, so that's been my trick with them. You know, I have my 4x5 set up here. We go through a full process of how you load stuff. And so I continue to kind of layer the process, because I can see when they're starting to get frustrated or they're starting to get overwhelmed. And I regularly tell them, this should be fun. Like, there's no reason anybody should be making images for work. Like, this should never be a thing that brings any kind of anxiety. So come back and forth, you know, as we figure this stuff out together. And I think they've been really responsive to that.
Edgar, I have a practical question. Well, one, how many students are in this class?
10.
And the other is, so this happens during this 3-hour period, you'll stay on Zoom and they'll go out and maybe make an exposure and then come back in.
Yeah, we do it both ways. One, you know, if they want to make exposures, they go out and make exposures, and then, you know, by class time they have stuff. But we do use class time. We have 3 hours. I'm like, there's no way I'm putting you on a lecture for 3 hours.
Yeah.
To talk about imagery. You guys are gonna, right, like, so I tell them, let's figure out. We're all going to troubleshoot together. Let's figure out. And I like to do it that way too, because different students have different problems.
Right.
And so all the students learn from each other, right? So it's a community setup. And so if someone else makes a mistake or if somebody else finds something out, like there's an app called Pinhole Assist. And I mentioned it to everybody. I said, you don't have to get it because it costs $2.99. So if you don't want to pay for it, don't. But it also accounts for reciprocity failure, right? So these are some of the things you're thinking about when you're using a pinhole camera and exposures are over a second long. So yeah, and it works really well that way.
Someone just asked about the lab fee. Is it that just a practical question? The students have to pay extra, or is this
You know what?
part of
I
their
don't know
tuition?
if they have an extra lab fee or not.
Okay.
When I took over the class, it seemed like, right, like you just had a class. They all right now, so MSU is doing everything kind of they can to figure this out, right? They're mailing stuff
Right.
out to students. So they're accounting for stuff. I think one of the other things that's happening is we've accounted for a lot of the materials in terms of like cameras, scanners, things of that nature that will be reused. But they bought their own chemistry for
Okay.
development. They buy their own film. The one thing we do buy for them is their cyanotype kits. So just Bostic and Sullivan, right? And that actually came from a grant. Somebody that regularly gives to the school gave us $10,000 for materials, and so everybody just submitted, what they needed for their classes, and was giving certain amounts of materials for that that'll go to the students.
That's great. Yeah. Michigan, not to change the subject, but Michigan State, what about 10, 15 years ago, got that Broad, that tons of money from the Broads. Anyway, just because I grew up in East Lansing, right? So I know, I know about that, but I was really aware of that. I don't want to change the subject, but I was really aware of that when I was at ASU, because I was like, wow, it's nice to have that.
Right.
But,
Yeah. And this was the Vallis Vallis grant. So I don't know who the family is, but yeah, they were like, here's $10,000, and that got split amongst everybody in the art school, right? From
nice.
ceramics, painting,
Yeah.
everybody else. So
Was it a COVID donation? Was it specific to deal
I
with
think it
COVID?
was because everybody was going online. So
Yeah.
specifically, since everybody was online, it's like, I mean, arts are based on having materials, right? You
Yeah.
can't just give them PDFs. So
That's great.
yeah.
So, I thank you for that. I really appreciate that. It's like, well, I think we're all already starting to think about the spring, and it looks like a lot of a lot of us are still going to be in this position. So I think it's super useful to see that, but that also kind of segues into some other things that you touched on at the beginning, and that you and I have talked about a little bit about. I mean, I don't want to oversimplify it, but like divergent ways of thinking. And yeah, I mean, you maybe talk a little bit more about that and the connection. Like your class obviously kind of draws both, like all photo, but maybe in particular for you, like your scientific study and skills, but also, the artistic. And maybe talk a little bit more about those ways of knowing a little bit, and maybe even in terms of your practice and what some of the things we talked about yesterday relative to that.
Yeah. And so there's a couple of things that I kind of fit into, right? So I have a master's in industrial organizational psychology as well. And a lot of the social sciences kind of they fit into one science as a method, right? So the scientific method is a way of controlling for a lot of different variables to say, all right, and you use that in photo regularly, right? If they're getting, some kind of issue, especially in the dark room, you're like, oh, it could be these three things. And I always say, well, you have to control for all those. You can't figure all those things at once because it's going to be a moving target. So it's just a way of starting to think kind of in this patterned way. But I mean, within the sciences, it's a great way to organize information. And you find out something, but you also have to say, so what do I do with that now? Right. And we've talked about this, about the intersection between what the sciences are doing and what humanists do, right? And within the humanities, arts included, it's an interrogation of meaning making, right? We know something, what does that mean to us, right? How does that relate to our relationship to things? One of the people that I studied was a big contribution to my dissertation was Aldo Leopold. And he always talks about, that his primary interest was people's relationship to land and people's relationship to other people, right? And for me, that's both of those are a sustainability issue, right? In terms of, environmental justice issues, who's affected the most, in our talk again, as we talk about the idea that, you know, we talk kind of about apocalyptic ideas, and we say, oh, we're going to be survivalist, and we're going to have to learn to hunt, and we're going to have to learn to kill our own food and find shelter. But what we're really finding out is that what we need to find is how to relate to other people and how to build community, because that social organization is what actually becomes really important when we're, dealing with conflict, when we're dealing with environmental tensions and scarcities. Like, the ability to organize actually becomes most critical. And so that's when I say within sustainability, yes, we have kind of an environmental component, but we also have strong social components. And within those, we have strong value structures, right? And so I found that the more that I've been doing in academia, that the problems we talk about sustainability are actually problems that relate out in the world, right? They're interdisciplinary. They don't sit in one space. We talk a lot about use-inspired research, but it's about, really finding what the problem is and finding every mechanism you have for dealing with that. And that has to do with relational components. That has to do with, understanding our relationship to other people and our relationship to the environment. And when I was in school, I used to talk a lot about, the fact that we're always mentioning human environment interactions. But human environment relationships is something very different. When you interact with someone, it's one thing. When you have a relationship with somebody, that's a very different thing. And I think that relationship thing really sits much more on the spectrum of the arts and humanities. And that's why it becomes so critical to have people in the arts and humanities at the table having these discussions.
I love how it's all connected to how you structured your class. I mean, just this idea, which I'm just going to pull back to the whole thing about FotoFika. I think that taking advantage of this moment to think about different ways of thinking and how there are all these connections. And as you said, Edgar, how everything, when you say everything is related, I don't mean that in a kind of Pollyanna-ish oversimplified way, but rather, I think at this moment when we're being forced to think about different ways to teach and different ways to get ideas across and to connect with our students or to connect with each other, it's really helpful for me, at least, to think about these different ways of knowing. And really, I mean, we talk about flipping the script, but, just this idea of really, looking to the left, right? And just, thinking, and I'm doing that, like twirling in anyway, I just think it's really great. I love the linkage. I love how you went from structuring your class to this, and how you're bringing in this one way of thinking and another way of thinking. I'm saying the same thing over and over, but I think I really appreciate that.
Yeah. So there's a third thing that I do, right? So I'm within sustainability. I'm regularly practice as an artist, and I work for the Center for Interdisciplinarity. And within there, we do what's called the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative. And so the biggest thing really about this is deep listening, but deep listening takes a long time. And so what we do is we shortcut that through philosophically structured dialogue. What that means is we usually set up prompts that look like a survey, but actually the questions often, or the prompts are often ambiguous, or they're polarizing, or they're framed in both positive or negative lights. And what happens is it causes people to reveal their assumptions really quickly, so that you can discuss why you thought you were discussing the same thing, actually you weren't. And why this is important is because we regularly know, and we regularly have this bias that, artists and scientists don't play well together, because scientists think that artists just make things pretty, right? And artists oftentimes think that scientists are either stuffy or busy doing something and don't understand outside of their world. And for the most part, those assumptions hold oftentimes if we don't have deeper conversations, right? And so for me, I've had these conversations for quite a long time. I'm trained in both kind of spaces. So I know how to like poke at things like, oh, okay, you're following these particular assumptions, right? You're following that artists are here to illustrate and beautify your designs that you've made, information out of. But that's not the case, right? And the more that we kind of collaborate at a slow pace together, the more we start to understand that art is a way of thinking, right? Art is knowledge production. And when you make things, you're thinking, you're figuring things out. And we structure things and organize things the same way that scientists do, right? We're making sense of the world. And so that's why it becomes so critical to co-produce this sense making, right? It becomes a reflexive exercise of scientists providing information, artists saying, wow, that's really interesting. How does it relate to not only what I do, but to humans oftentimes, right? Or to our relationship to things. And that usually causes the scientist to say, wow, I never thought of it that way. I'm doing one project right now with some entomologists, and people that work with bugs. What's that have to do with climate change sustainability, right? But I connect it by, finding out that, these people that work in these entomology labs and these people that run them are still very much human beings. They're not, politicized or polarized, and they often work with farmers. Because one of the things that we have going on here is we have this invasive fruit fly, and cherries and blueberries are huge in Michigan. But this fruit fly doesn't eat rotting fruit; it eats fresh fruit, and you don't know your fruit is rotted until it's too late. The larvae are kind of inside the fruit, and so it becomes like a very serious, practical, economic, right, livelihood issue here. And you can start seeing this project kind of starts to reflect on climate change isn't a political issue. It's not a values issue in the way people think it is, of being, a progressive or a liberal or a conservative. Um, it has to do with farms and with people, and how do we actually reflect that, right? So it's a way of bringing a lot of these things to light. I've provided a link to this a couple of times on the Photo Professor site. So I wrote this book, and it's again on sustainability, how philosophically they fit together, art and sustainability, or art and science. There's a chapter on kind of the history around aesthetics and how we've come to think about aesthetics and what other things we should be thinking about in terms of sustainability or ecological aesthetics, with a lot with Leopold. But then it ends with a project that of the backyard as an ecological space, right? So it's a combination of thinking theoretically, writing, and also photographic work. And then the other project I wanted to mention was Los Americanex, right, on American identity and primarily Latinos here in Detroit, which this is how the project started. Really thinking about what identifies an American, who an American is, and people that came here in the 1920s to work in the car plants here. But and the funny thing about Detroit is south of the border is Canada. So, right, there's still another country south of the border. So playing off these ideas. And so I made these pictures very dark because you have to use a flashlight. So there's kind of a performative component to it. This is what they look like hung up. And you actually use a flashlight to look at them, right? This act often is thought of, whether it's border patrol, whether it's police, it feels like an aggressive act. So there's a way of implicating yourself and looking at the images. But the other thing is about that uncomfortableness being something that is necessary for having dialogue and discourse. And so there were people who were unwilling to do it. It serves a little bit as a Rorschach test. Some people, one person who's very educated, Princeton, Stanford, MFA, comes, and as she thought that this was a very violent act, the act of using the flashlight was a very violent act, which is really interesting because everybody that came from the community really enjoyed it, and they thought that it was very compelling, and it was a great way to represent how they were thinking about this. We also did, so these prints up top were made by the students. So again, in terms of representation, thinking about how students, and these are high school and middle school students, about who creates the narratives. I held a session with them that both went through like a presentation of how we think about portraiture and what portraiture means, and how gesture and clothes and all these things matter. And then I took them all into a studio and they all photographed each other. And I basically served as their photo assistant, so that they could make images. And obviously these are made in light of doing the whole project, but it was a way of helping them kind of start thinking through how they photograph each other beyond kind of the Instagram age of the selfie. So I'll leave it at that, since I'm sure there's questions.
All right, well, we're starting to lose the crowd. So thank you, Edgar, again, for an amazing presentation. Really appreciate your time today and all of your insightfulness. Thanks, everybody, for being here. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
All right, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Great to see you all.